Let's turn now to Romans 14 Unplugged, Feasts and Fasts and Food. Oh my. All right. As you can tell from the title of my study, and this is an ongoing series, we'll just keep going until I finish through my notes. As you can tell by the title, I don't believe that the chapter that Paul wrote is designed to be interpreted the way it's traditionally understood in most Christian circles. That's not to say I don't think that Paul was concerned about mending relationships and between two people groups who had differences of opinions on certain matters, like many Christian groups would teach you if you heard your average sermon on this particular chapter. To be sure, that is one of the primary thrusts of the instructions given in Romans 14. We should not judge one another despite our differences of opinions on certain matters. We certainly can't be in a place where we're looking down on one another because we're all one body. But what I'm trying to do as I'm engaging with you all during these studies is to introduce you to this idea that, I'm telling you this right up front so you can kind of follow along with the study. As I interact with the passage here, I'll try not to make this too long. Paul was writing from within Jewish subgroups, not from outside of it. It's anachronistic to read back into the text Paul speaking to church groups, Gentile Christians and Jews, who'd already broken away from Judaism and were forming their own Christian Gentile groups that were other than related to Judaism or had no connection to the Jewish synagogues or anything, Jewish authority or anything like that. But as we allow history to speak to us more accurately, it's more likely, and there are lots of clues in the text, it's more likely that the subgroups that Paul was writing to were still very much attached to and familiar with and interacting with Jewish synagogal communities, lots of unsaved Jews, if you want to call them that, using the label non-Christian Jews is the term I've been using, or non-Messianic Jews. And so we had kind of this mix, this social experiment, as you were, going on in the first century, where largely religious communities in Paul's day were composed of synagogue Jews, religious Jews, but along come Gentiles interested in Judaism, along with Jews who are embracing Jesus as the Messiah, so they became Messianic Jews. But all in all, the point is the greater, larger umbrella religious faith community in Paul's day was still religious Judaism, or the Judaisms, if you want to really give them a plural, based on the denominational aspect. As you went from place to place, you had some kind of denominational differences. That's why I used the phrase Judaisms, plural. But the point being is they were connected to one another more closely than we don't often always think. And this causes us to rethink the way we read the passage as it applied to them first, and then as we can make some practical application today, even though now we've already split. We, the church, have split basically from the synagogue, and they, the synagogue, have split from us. And so the two are kind of somewhat mutually exclusive, hopefully not always mutually hostile or, at odds with one another, but particularly divided when it comes to our loyalties and our faith aspect and things like that. So that's the challenge that we have to work with. So on that note, in my commentary, we're in the section asking the question, looking at verses 10 through 13, which is why I read them in the liturgy. Who is the brother? Who is the brother? And I'll just tell you right up front, from a cursory glance and from reading through Christian commentaries, your average Christian commentary is going to tell you that the word brother is found throughout the apostolic scriptures as primarily a reference to a believer in Jesus. And I actually agree with that. So don't get me wrong. Don't make me say something I'm not saying. The brother in the apostolic scriptures, the New Testament, is typically your brother Christian. Whether you're Jew and Gentile, that doesn't matter. But the fact that you are attaching yourself to a Messianic community, whether it's a home church, a synagogue group, a Messianic group, wherever, but the fact that you are saying that I am part of the chosen when it comes to believing in Jesus, I have laid hold of faith in Messiah, and I believe in the whole promise of the Spirit and things like that. I am a brother with the others. So that's primarily. However, here's the challenge. If we are correct that the groups in Paul's day were, when it comes to the faith communities, were broad enough to understand that the synagogue community, which was largely made up of unbelieving Jews, was the original users of this phrase brother Jew or brother Israelite, and brother covenant member, then from Paul's perspective, because he sees that God is not done with national Israel yet, he understands that God has a plan for national Israel, all the while bringing Gentiles into the covenant relationship through his son Yeshua. Then for Paul, at times, brother can be broad enough, I believe, to include Jews and Gentiles, whether believing and unbelieving, or unbelieving when it comes to Messiah. Sorry about that. But definitely brother covenant members. So that's the real kicker. So the challenge is this: don't see brother as exclusively relating to Jews and Gentiles who lay claim to Jesus as Messiah. It could also mean brother covenant member. So if I were a Gentile Christian in Paul's day, and Paul said, look at your brother over there, do you pray for him? And if Paul's pointing to an unbelieving Jew, I would understand that Paul's using this word brother to mean brother covenant member, not brother believer in Jesus. Even though I'm a Gentile believer in Jesus, I'm a Christian. But my brother Jew, he's a brother covenant member because we both have the same covenant relationship to God, in the sense that we both believe that God is the only true God there is. We don't believe in false gods and pagan gods and idolatrous gods and things like that. So we have the same loyalty to God, faithfulness to God. And we both believe in the same set of scriptures, right? Remember, the only inspired scriptures in Paul's day was the Old Testament, the Tanakh. There wasn't any New Testament just yet. Paul was penning those, right? So we have to have a covenant connection to the scriptures of Israel. And at the same time, we also understand that we have a covenant connection to one another via the promises that God is giving to his people, the elect. So Israel is the elect, but the remnant of Israel, the Christians, the Gentiles that are being brought in and grafted in and attached to Israel, are also the elect. They're the elect within the elect. They're Israel within Israel, the smaller Israel within a larger Israel. And so the smaller brother would be the Christians, the larger brother, or the larger definition would be the unbelieving Jews. People who are not included in the brother would be the world at large, who's not claiming faith in God and loyalty to God's ways and covenant membership or anything. So they're outside of covenant membership because they haven't accepted God as their only God at all. So they're outside of brotherhood altogether. They're outside of covenant membership. So we're talking about covenant brothers. So with that, let me finish reading through. Oh, I'm sorry. Before I look at that, look at Romans 14. Remember I said there was a variant in the Greek. Romans 14, starting in I think it's verse 13. Let me drop down and show you what I'm talking about, why it bears relevance for this particular study. Let's see. I'm sorry. It is verse... where did I see it? Okay, here it is. It's verse 10. All right. So for those of you who are with me in the live class, you can see I've got this tool pulled up from BibleHub.com. And it's the interlinear, so we can see all of the morphology, which means all of the Greek and the parts of speech and the Strong's numbers and the English and things like that. We've got the Greek script right there and the English below it. And so the Greek says, Su de ti krines tana delphon su e kai su ti exutenes tana delphon su. Pantes gar parastesamatha to bema ti tu theu. And as I mentioned during my liturgy, the last 5 Greek words, parastesamatha to... I'm sorry, let me start with the last right here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, last 7 Greek words. So we have pantes, all, gar, for, parastesamatha, will stand before, to, the, bemati, let me scroll up a little bit there. Bemati, judgment seat. You probably heard your pastor say bema seat. This is where he gets this from. Bema seat is rooted right in the Greek word bema. So bemati, judgment seat. To, the genitive of theu, God, also genitive. So God's judgment seat is how we would kind of clean it up if we were trying to show possessive. So bemati tu theu. The variant, if I jump over to this part of the tool, can be seen in these various Greek versions. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 different Greek versions pulled up for us on the screen right now. Just from top to bottom, we've got the Nestle 1904. We've got the Westcott and Hort in 1881. We've got the Westcott and Hort NA27 and UBS 4 variants. We've got the RP Byzantine Majority Text 2005. Down near the bottom, we've got the Greek Orthodox Church, the Tischendorf 8th edition, the Scrivener's Textus Receptus from 1894, and then we've got the Stephanus Textus Receptus from 1550. So these are some different textual versions that we can look at, and I'm trying to make this really quick because I don't want to bog you down on all the Greek grammar. But the only thing I want you to see is just the very last, even if you can't read Greek, you can see the differences. I'm going to highlight the passage. So the first one, to bema ti tu theou, the judgment seat of God. The second one, also, to bema ti tu theou. To bema ti tu theou, the third one. But now look at the fourth one, to bema ti tu Christou, judgment seat of Christ. Once again, also in the sixth one, to bema ti tu Christou. And then the seventh one, to bema ti tu theou again, to bema ti tu Christou, and then once again, to bema ti tu Christou. So the bottom line is the last word is the word you're looking for. We got theou, theou, theou. That's God, God, God. Then we have Christou, that's Christ. Then we have Christou, Christ again. Then we have theou, God, Christou, Christ, Christou, Christ. What's the big deal? If we drop a little bit further down, we'll see from some of these parallel versions that the NASB, which follows the Greek text that is older in date but newer at the time that we discovered it, it follows saying judgment seat of God. That's what we might call the minority text. It's the smaller amount of textual family that we can work from. The majority text, or the Textus Receptus, the one that's in use by the KJV, which from a historical point of view, we found them first, we discovered them in history first, but chronologically, as for when they were written, they're older than they're newer than the one that's used by the NASB. So this one says judgment seat of Christ, and that's why we have the difference: theou for God, Christos for Christ. And then if you look at the Treasury of Scripture Knowledge for these are just kind of references that use some similar language. If we look at this one right here, 1 Corinthians, I'm sorry, not 1 Corinthians. This one right here, 2 Corinthians 5:10 says, "For we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ." And the Greek there has bema ti tu Christou. So it's this statement that caused people such as perhaps the translators to switch over to Christ here, because maybe the copyists, maybe the scribes changed it in the majority text version. We don't know. In other words, which one's the original? Which one did Paul write? Did he write theou or did he write Christou? And does it matter? Okay, here's why I'm even bringing it up. From a theological perspective, if the brother is a Christian, right, Jews and Gentiles, and they're both Christians, and there are no unbelieving Jews within the purview of our particular commentary at all, then why would Paul speak of unbelieving Jews standing before the judgment seat of Christ? Right? Some might ask that question. But if we broaden the, if we say that what Paul wrote was originally the judgment seat of God, and whether you're a believer or an unbeliever, you're definitely going to stand in front of the judgment seat of God. God is going to judge you, like we read about. If we look at the Romans 14, we start in verse 10 and keep going. We'll all stand before the judgment seat of God. And they say, as is written, every knee will bow, every tongue will bow to me, and every tongue shall confess to God, again, theou. So then each of us will give an account of himself. Notice the context of the peaceful people giving the account is to God and not to Christ. And again, the Greek supports that. Theou, and theou. It's God, God, God. So it seems to be that probably Paul did originally write God. This would then broaden the understanding of a brother covenant member, even though he's an unbeliever, not a Christian, standing before God's judgment seat, versus Christians standing only before the judgment seat of the Messiah, as opposed to standing before God's judgment seat for all humanity. We could talk about that a little bit later. Those are some of the implications, perhaps, behind looking at this as standing before the judgment seat of God instead of standing before the judgment seat of Messiah, or something to that effect. So, as I mentioned, I don't want to get deep into that right now, but that's perhaps some of the implications behind maybe the differences between the variations, which one's the accurate. Who knows? Paul really wrote judgment seat of Christ, and maybe then brother does really mean only Christians. And we can talk about that in time. But for now, what I want to do is this week and next week, as I mentioned, we'll try and finish up on this section, on this part of my commentary, Who's the Brother? So with that, 2 weeks from now, we can start jumping into what exactly does nothing is unclean in itself imply. Let's finish reading Mark Nanos. He wrote a paper called Romans to the Churches of the Synagogues of Rome. And this is giving us the background behind perhaps the viewpoint that I'm holding with is that the subgroups within Paul's writing in the first century were still very much actively interacting with synagogue communities to the point that it was not unusual to find believing Jews and unbelieving Jews in the same community, along with believing Gentiles and unbelieving Gentiles in the same crowd. The commonality behind all of them, and this is a careful distinction I need to make, is that they were all vying for covenant membership within the scope of God's promises and protection. So we're excluding pagans, we're excluding just your average secular, Jew or Gentile who didn't give a hoot about God or his promises or the Bible or Israel or the Messiah or the Spirit or any of that like we have today. We're talking about covenant membership to the point that it outlined interest from Jews and Gentiles who were brought into the scope of dealing with God on a covenant level. So we're talking about people who joined themselves to Israel who were outside of Israel, but we're definitely talking about people who were within Israel already within covenant boundaries. That's the point I'm trying to bring up and the distinction I need to make. So with that in mind, let's scroll down and read through this last paragraph. I read part of this last week, and we'll finish it tonight, at least this particular part. So we're going to start right there. All right, this is Mark Nanos. He says, the traditional position, speaking of Christian theology and the way your average Christian reads through this part of the Bible and Paul. The traditional position is generally presented in binary this or that theological terms, thus Christ or Torah, often labeled law. And when he says Christ or Torah, he's really meaning Christ versus Torah or Christ versus law. This is really the binary or the bifurcation or the what's the word I'm looking for? The dichotomy that is set up in your average Gentile Christian Bible setting, is that Christ is opposite of the law. So that's what I mean by Christ or Torah or Christ versus law, Christ versus Torah. So if you ask your average pastor, are you under the law of Christ or are you under the law of Moses? Almost across the board, you're going to get the answer being, I'm under the law of Christ. I'm not under the law of Moses, meaning I'm not obligated to keep the law or things like that. But I am obligated to keep the law of Christ because Paul teaches that we're under the law of Christ. So we have this a binary or dichotomy or a set at odds one another, this versus that contest between these terms. So listen to Mark Nanos explain this. Christ versus the law, concluding that Christ replaced Torah, making the latter obsolete for guiding life among Christ followers, or that is how it should be, i.e. traditional Paulinism is defined based on a law-free gospel. This is what, again, your average Christian commentary or seminary is going to teach you. He continues, within a few centuries, that position, about was Paul teaching a law-free gospel, it actually was made official policy for Christendom. That is to say, no Christians, even former Jews who converted to Christianity, were permitted to attend Jewish meetings or practice Jewish rites or ways of life. And this was apparently the view of some, although by no means all, Christ-following non-Jews already in the early 2nd century, e.g. Ignatius of Antioch. So the point is, go back and look at your history, and you'll find that essentially the Gentile Christian church made a concerted break away from Judaism as a whole and away from law-keeping and identifying as a group that was related to Judaism and law-keeping. And basically, Gentile Christianity formed their own identity separate and distinct from Judaism and the separate and distinct from law keeping, and it was solidified in the centuries following the first century, so second, third, fourth, fifth centuries, till we get to where we are today, where your average Gentile Christian is confident that they have really no connection to Israel or to Judaism or to the law of Moses, and that's just the way we're taught. And so that's what we're looking at. We just need to be kind of aware of that. I'm not trying to slam people for this position. I disagree with it, right? But I'm not trying to slam you if that's the way you were raised and the way you were taught. We can't help teaching that's just been passed along from one generation to the other. What we can do is become better informed ourselves and go back and read through the scriptures and begin to pray about, as Gentile Christians, am I truly separated from Israel? Am I really disconnected from the covenant people of God? Am I really unattached to the law of Moses? Lord, help me understand my relationship to these particular topics. So let's keep reading here as I scroll down on the next page. Mark Nanos continues, following from these premises, the primary problems Paul addressed in Rome are usually, again, this is your popular view of Paul, they're usually understood to have risen from the failure of some within the Christ-following community. Notice he doesn't say Christians, because that's, again, is also anachronistic. Paul didn't use the word Christian in any of his letters. Does that mean he wasn't writing to Christians? No. Of course he understood that they were Christians. I'm just saying that from a text point perspective, he didn't use that term Christian, but he understood believer in Messiah. So Mark Nanos is simply trying to alert us to the idea that maybe this term Christian has this kind of baggage attached to it. From our perspective, it conjures up this idea of someone who's disconnected from Judaism, someone who's disconnected from the Torah. And so the term Christian is often used in that way. Oh, I'm not a Jew, I'm a Christian. I don't follow the law of Moses, I follow the law of Christ because I'm a Christian, I'm a New Testament Christian, or something to that effect. But what we need to be aware of is that Paul was a Jew and he was a Torah follower, and yet he was, to use air quotes with my fingers, he was a Christian as well. So Christian cannot mean exclusively someone who's disconnected from Judaism or does not follow after Torah, because Paul was definitely a Christian, and yet Paul was a Jew, and Paul was a Torah follower. He was obedient to Torah. So we need to re-educate ourselves on these terminologies. That's why Mark Nanos is not using the term Christian. It's not that he doesn't like it, it's that he's trying to be accurate to put our mind back into the social setting that we're dealing with when we're reading through Paul's letters. So let's continue. So he uses the phrase Christ-following community instead of Christian. But as he mentioned in this commentary that we're reading, the Christians of the day believe that that the followers of the first century were to respect this change of eons and to live free from Torah and the value of Jewish identities, such as the weak in Romans 14, according to most interpretations, or alternatively from the misguided teachings of those who promoted Torah and Jewish identity alongside of commitment to Christ. So, in case you got lost in that long sentence there, your average interpreter of Paul's writings, and I use the word average there, I'm just trying to challenge us. Please don't become openly offended when it seems like I'm picking on Christians all the time. I'm not picking on Christians. I'm trying to alert us as modern Christians to the idea that there is possibly and probably some blindness, some deficiencies when it comes to the way we are reading and interpreting our Bibles, and it's something that we can do something about. It's a problem that can be fixed if we simply shore up our history a little bit and the way we understand what's taking place from Paul's perspective to today. So what Nanos is simply trying to alert us to the fact is that, unfortunately for religious Jews, many times your average Gentile Christian is going to read the New Testament as a free from Torah book, and a Paul that's writing to Christians who are he's telling them to break away from Judaism and to leave that old dispensation or eon behind, because the new age has dawned and the New Testament has arrived, and all of that old is old and the new is new, and along with the old, the Jewish people are out, the Christian Gentiles are in, the church is in, God has replaced Israel. And so that viewpoint that I'm describing, which is unfortunate and detrimental and disrespectful of Jewish lifestyle and Torah keeping and things like that. That particular perspective finds its home in replacement theology, some parts of dispensational theology, and definitely in supersessionism. And that's the viewpoint that, unless you're alerted to that fact, unless you're aware of that bias that you may have, that you may not be aware of, unless you're aware of that, it's going to cause you to read the text through a coloring and a perspective that's, again, it's not friendly to Judaism. It's not friendly and respectful of Torah keeping at all. And so it's going to have to cause you to disconnect from large parts of the Bible, particularly the disconnect from the Old Testament to the New Testament. We're trying to avoid that as Bereans. We're trying to think the way we interpret Paul and his writings and the audience that he's writing to. That's why we're going through these exercises. They can be painful at times, a little embarrassing to some of us, a little jarring to our nerves. It's tough changing paradigms. I understand. It takes time. Just take your time. Pray about it. Work through it. You and the Holy Spirit work it out. Sit down with a good Torah teacher and work it out. And you'd be amazed how passages can just open up to you if you allow the Holy Spirit to change the way you're looking at scriptures. I'm not saying give up on Jesus. Absolutely not. I'm not saying deny Messiah. Never, never. Don't even think such a thing. I'm simply saying that Paul wouldn't have had a problem with Gentiles in his day understanding their relationship to Israel and their responsibilities to Torah. That's the challenge. So let's keep reading Nanos. Secondarily, however, Paul ostensibly, that is supposedly, did not want the implications of that theological viewpoint to be taken too far. Thus, he called for his audience to adjust their social behavior to avoid offending any weak Christian-following Jews, and perhaps Judaized, let me scroll up a little bit, perhaps Judaized non-Jews among themselves, and also to not think that God had rejected those Jews who did not yet share their commitment to Christ. So again, we'll keep working our way through this this week and next week. In case you're getting lost, let's finish up with this final paragraph here. Nanos remarks, those traditional ways of approaching Paul as well as Romans are easily challenged. They really are, from so many angles, historically, theologically, contextually, and textually as well. There's many problems with the traditional way of looking at Paul as a law-free gospel writer, as someone who's telling Gentile Christians to steer clear of Judaism, stay away from unbelieving Jews, steer clear of the Torah and any commitment to a law-based lifestyle, anything like that. There are manifold problems with that perspective. We'll just keep working this out little by little. Don't give up on me just yet, okay? In these texts, Nano says, I find reason to propose that Paul and his communities, including the community he did not found but wrote to in Rome, listen up, were they separated from Judaism? No. They were subgroups of the Jewish communities that believed Jesus represented the dawning of the awaited age. So they were Jewish communities. They were subgroups. They were within the scope of the synagogue family, but they were subgroups. So they were connected at some stage. The Jews in these subgroups, Nanos continues, Paul included, observed the covenantal obligations of Torah, for they were Jews fully involved in a fully Jewish movement. Right? For them, like Paul says, we're members of this sect known as the Way, which is a sect of Judaism. There was not a new religion known as Christianity that Paul was inventing in the first century. There's so many problems with that perspective. He was not inventing a new religion. He could not really. Rome wouldn't have allowed him. The emperors would have seen it as some sort of threat to their own Roman cult. The point being is Paul considered himself and the groups that he was writing to as connected to the synagogue groups in a way. They upheld that by the gift of the Holy Spirit, now made available with the arrival of the awaited age to come, they were enabled to practice their commitment to the God of Israel according to the highest ideals of Torah. And this last paragraph, this is going to be a little confusing for some of you. The non-Jews who joined them, right, who joined Paul's religious groups, did not become Jews. That's true. And they were thus not under the Mosaic legislation Torah on the same terms as Jews. That last sentence about not being under the Mosaic law on the same terms as Jews, I'll have to talk about that a little bit later, because I think perhaps either I'm misunderstanding Nanos or I'm either outright disagreeing with some of his theology there. But I don't want to get into it now. point being is non-Jewish states, these subgroups were committed to lives of righteousness, speaking specifically of the people from the nations, the Gentiles. They were committed to lives of righteousness defined in Jewish communal terms, and thus by Torah, for they met in Jewish groups, and thus according to the Jewish norms for these groups, and enabled by the same Spirit of God. Are you understanding those last few sentences there? Paul would have understood and expected the Gentile believers in his groups to have a basic understanding of righteousness defined by the Torah as was practiced by the Judaisms of his day, more or less. So righteousness was already spelled out in the Bible, in the Tanakh, and it was practiced, at least in written form. I know there were some oral factions that came along and added a bunch of extra fences and this and that and those. And we could talk about those differences from Messianic group to Messianic group. The point, however, was that the standard of righteousness was described by God in the scriptures that Israel carried. There weren't other religious groups that Paul would have given his stamp of approval on in his day. It wasn't the Catholic Church that Paul could have said, you can practice Jewish religious righteousness, or you can go over to the Catholic cathedral down the street, and they have basically the same version of righteousness, albeit from a non-Jewish perspective. Nope, wasn't available. Paul likewise couldn't have instructed his Gentile believers to attend the First Baptist or Presbyterian or Methodist or Lutheran church down the street either. He couldn't have even directed them to the SDAs, right? The Seventh-day Adventists, or the Mormons, or the Jehovah's Witnesses, God forbid. There was nowhere really for Paul to push them over to. They couldn't have even gone over to the, say, the Islamic mosque, or something to that effect. Now, if he wanted to send them overseas to, say, Asia and, say, join maybe the Confucius groups or the Buddhist groups or any other Eastern type religions, yeah, I suppose he could have sent them there. But would he have really done that? Come on, you guys know where I'm going with this. In the first century, and particularly within the land of Israel and the outlying diaspora, which would included parts of Asia, major and minor, Italy, where Paul's writing to, Rome, and respecting areas of Greek and Roman boundaries, all of that part of the world, there were essentially, from Paul's perspective, a binary aspect when it came to religion. Two. When I say binary, that's just two ways of looking at the world. You either had access to God and his true righteousness through the Judaisms, or you were out. You're outside of that scope of righteousness. Everything else was pagan. Everything else was other. Everything else was darkness, right? All the Roman religions and the Greek religions and the barbaric religions and all of those other worldly religions and Zoroastrianism and all the other religions that were was Zoroastrianism around that time? I think so. Gnosticism and things like that. All of these other things were options that Paul was steering his Gentile believers away from. What he was steering them to was the righteousness that was defined and outlined in the scriptures given to Israel. That's the only standard that Paul was going to uphold. It's the only one he quotes from authoritatively, is the Tanakh. He's not quoting from other authors and poets and Greek writers and philosophers of his day in order to give them authority. In fact, he's not even quoting from the rabbis of his day to give them authority either. He's quoting from Moses. He's quoting from the prophets. He loves Isaiah. He's quoting from, these premier prophets, and he's quoting from the Psalms, and he's just pulling material out of God's breathed scriptures, God's inspired scriptures. And that's the point that we need to come back to over and over and over again.